Here's the summary for the class. First off, and probably most importantly, because I think people have a real hard time just sort of figuring this out. Remember that scale is sort of irrelevant in the subject that we're looking at. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at a bedroom, a home, a mall, or whatever it is. Symbolism and the use of space apply in very standardized patterns at all those different scales. It's almost like changing the focus on something. You're changing whether something's going in and out in terms of what you're looking at, but the actual process is the same. So always remember that when you're looking at this, it doesn't matter whether you're an interior designer trying to figure out what to do with the bathroom, or if you're a cultural geographer trying to figure out why people don't go to downtown, Honolulu. It's all part of the same pattern. Key to this, everyone lives in a very complex symbolic world. And this has several side effects, especially because you remember fall semester long and pointing out that symbols are arbitrary. They're defined by the group. So the group collectively basically gives something a definition, and the group accepts that definition, and that then is what that particular thing means. It's not related to the object. For example, in a local context, Hawaiian flags have very different perceptions depending on who's looking at the flag. Now, the object's the same. It's a piece of cloth or nylon that has a print on it. But how people view that thing varies tremendously depending on who they are. And that's always important to remember that almost everything that people hold important is symbolic. Now, what that also means at some point is, on one hand, it makes it very difficult if you're in a group that you're not familiar with to figure out what the symbolic content is. But secondly, it also means if you are aware of that, what the symbolic content is, you can then manipulate or use it by using that particular object, and how you do the symbolic reference of it, allow you to, in many cases, transmit an enormously large amount of information with one image or one object. So symbols can be very confusing. Symbols can also be tremendously efficient in terms of sending large amounts of information, emotion, attitude, and values in just one thing. And this is something that you always have to be very, very aware of. I think interior designers intuitively sometimes do this, but I don't think they really think about it. What is the symbolic content, for example, of a couch? There is a lot of symbolic content in couch, especially depending on what type of couch it is. But I don't know that folks necessarily think about that. Of course, clients don't at all, but they nonetheless see the couch within its symbolic content. Symbols aren't just physical objects. They're also the spatial pattern of objects, how space is used or manipulated, and other senses, for example, light, sound, smell. All these are an important part of symbolism, and again, are different from one group to another. And oftentimes when people say something's exotic because they're in a group they're not familiar with, it's because these changes are there and they're not really noticing them consciously. In other words, they don't understand the symbolic content, but they're aware that they're different. And this is key because you have to remember, for most groups, a lot of the symbols that are important to them, they don't think about the symbols. The symbols work at an almost subconscious or non-conscious level. Again, like an American flag. To Americans, and even non-Americans, I suppose, that piece of cloth has a tremendously strong set of things attached to it, and much of which I don't even think people think about consciously. Just it's almost like an emotional gut reaction to it. That's true of many things that are symbols. So you always have to keep that in place because, of course, you can also use that or manipulate it. You can also, if you want to, and this is done frequently by artists, especially in plastic arts, you can put symbols in an inappropriate or unusual or different situation, and can then frequently sort of wake people up. You can actually manipulate how people notice something by, I suppose, for lack of a better term, misuse of symbol, putting something in outside of its context. Now, of course, doing this unintentionally can cause trouble. Doing this intentionally is oftentimes called art. The landscapes and symbols that existed in the past, as long as the group's pretty much the same, have persisted into the present. And a large part of what cultural geographers like I am, or like mining did back in the 80s, is to look at those past landscapes and the evidence that they still have in the present. Again, this was a whole chunk of the semester, especially when you think of the American landscapes. On one hand, they are of the past, but then you still see them, in subdivisions in Kapolei and Ho'opili and such like that in 2020s. So cultural landscapes morph and change, but in most cases, there's some sort of context to the past. And again, you have to remember the sort of weird part about that is even though people want that relationship with the past, they don't think about it or actually understand it. They just expect it. The things that people symbolically put on objects or the other, sounds, noise, whatever it is, are invariably things that are important to them. If they're individually important to that particular person, then that can oftentimes be sort of idiosyncratic. If it's to the collective, then it's a way that they share membership. So again, if you're looking at folks who identify, for example, my background, people that go to powwows as Native Americans, the way that you dress, the appropriate behavior, where you stand, who you stand next to, all this type of stuff, not only is shared by the folks in the group, but it's also in many cases intentionally not shared to folks outside of the group. So it's a way to basically both emphasize group membership and also distance yourself from the outsiders. In other words, insiders versus outsiders, or members and non-members. It also is then a way to manifest shared values and attitudes by virtue of how people use and manipulate those particular symbols. You see a lot of this if you go to the Merry Monarch Festival in Hilo, in terms of the manipulation of symbolism to define group membership, because there's a lot of different groups at Merry Monarch. There's people that go there as tourists, people that go there because of art in terms of dance, people that go there because they've got different agendas. And they're all, if you watch them, there's these very complicated patterns of behavior that go on in terms of what people are doing, how they're displaying, where they're displayed, that are intended as a form of messaging. And in many cases, it's a messaging that's only understandable to insiders. And this is an important part of group. To a certain extent, if you're an interior designer, what you're going to see in someone who, just bought $4 million house or $4 million condo in Kaka'ako, and they want you to design the interior and something that makes it more reflective of the cost of the project. Their sense of the symbols that define wealth in American society or Korean society or Chinese society, whatever it might be, are going to be really, really key to them. And some of those symbols might be entirely abstracted or unseen by folks who aren't members of that, say someone who's wealthy in Korea. Other folks might not see that or understand it, and that's partially intentional. If you're part of a group that sees themselves as different, you don't want everyone else to necessarily understand what it is you're presenting or the symbols that you're showing. Last part is that, when you look at symbols, and especially today with the huge growth of social media, there's sort of an assumption of universality of symbols, which really isn't the case. And you see this frequently when people will use a symbol and all of a sudden someone disses on because they quote misused it. And you also see this with, for example, it's oftentimes seen as the universality of material culture. Real good example would be Starbucks, say 20, 30 years ago, expanded globally, had Starbucks all around the world, and assumed that everyone was consuming American coffee in an American coffee shop, just like they go to Seattle. I remember going to the Starbucks when it first opened in Shanghai, and how Chinese used, in fact, still used coffee shops is totally different than how Americans use coffee shops. To them, it's a sense of being cosmopolitan, international, being sophisticated, and not being a rural hick. There's a whole set of stuff in Chinese society that involve coffee consumption because Chinese have no tradition of drinking coffee. In fact, in the past, coffee was seen as something of colonialism and they hated it. So coffee consumption, who knows now in Shanghai in 2020s, but coffee consumption in the 1990s, 2000s in China had an entirely different logic to it. And in fact, if you even go to Japan, if you go to Starbucks and Osaka, for example, you'll find that Japanese don't see Starbucks as being the same as Americans see Starbucks. It's the same company, sells the same coffee, has the same products inside, same cups, same everything. The Japanese perception of that and their symbolic logic they put on the coffee shop is in many cases really radically different than Americans. And Starbucks, for example, had a huge amount of trouble with this initially because they assumed that since it was the same object, there was a universality in terms of how the objects were consumed, used, and seen. And that they finally sort of grew up about 15 years ago and realized that that wasn't the case. Other companies that tried to go international have frequently found to their disaster that, how that screws up. So global design is oftentimes a goal, especially of modern social media driven market capitalism in the 21st century. But there's very little evidence that it actually plays out that way. If someone's consuming something that's, American, you can't assume that they're consuming the same way Americans can. They might be consuming it because they want to be seen as American. They might be consuming it because they don't want to be seen as local. You don't know. And it's going to be entirely in the context of that. So the symbol, since there's no relationship between object and symbol, global design has generally been a failure. And this is why you see in interior design, global design oftentimes doesn't work because people assume a universality of, for example, the layout of a living room without realizing that in a different culture, they might be taking that, American or European style living room because they want to look like something else, not because it has the same set of meanings to it. So in that context, it's important to remember that that's why this class is what it is. Despite the fact that there's a lot of stuff that you can buy globally, different groups, different cultures, different subgroups within different cultures treat the world and see the world, perceive and function the world differently. And that's, what if you're good in this field, that's what you understand and try to take advantage of. And that's what keeps it a fascinating area to look at.